Well, good afternoon, everyone. Is everyone enjoying the conference so far? All right. Well, we are so excited to be here with you today here in Amsterdam. Helen and I are excited to present to you a topic that's very relevant and interesting for us, and I hope you'll find it as interesting as well.
Thanks, Sam. So welcome, everyone. My name is Helen, and I'm a team lead in the Global Scheme Compliance team at Adyen, overseeing, amongst other things, the PCI standards globally. I have first-hand experience managing risk from the acquirer and merchant perspective with regards to security and compliance programs. Over to you, Sam.
And I'm Sam Pfanstiel. I'm the principal analyst at Toast. Toast is a payment facilitator providing payment processing through our cloud-based point of sale. We run for hospitality, restaurant, retail merchants in North America, Europe, Australia, and we're ever growing every day. I do run our PCI compliance program, which includes overseeing controls for meeting compliance requirements against PCI DSS, SSF, Secure Software and Secure Software Lifecycle, PCI PIN, and PCI PTS. Our latest PTS-approved handheld payment device is the Toast Go 3, and we're excited to release that here in Europe as a part of our PIN EMV strategy. I do work closely with our acquiring partners, including Adyen, and our merchant risk teams in support of our sub-merchant compliance through attestations, responsibility matrices, guidance documentation, and compliance reporting. Now, in today's session, we're going to provide you an overview of payment facilitation, or PayFacs. Now, PayFacs, Helen will cover the timeline and the model, this ecosystem that we're excited to be a part of, including the process flows. We'll also be covering the entities that exist across the payment facilitation ecosystem, such as the sub-merchants, the PayFacs, or master merchants, marketplaces, which are a similar type of master merchant, and acquirers, the brands, and of course, PCI SSC. And then we'll cover some strategies for PayFacs in both the responsibilities and reporting best practices that you guys can take away with you here today.
Great. So starting with the PayFac overview. So why is this topic actually timely and important? Well, the rapid global expansion of platforms, SaaS providers, and marketplaces has fueled the PayFac model, making it one of the fastest growing business models in the payment industry. This model significantly lowers the barrier to entry for smaller merchants, but also shifts a huge compliance and security responsibility onto the PayFac. In the PayFac model, the PayFac, not the acquiring bank, is typically responsible for ensuring PCI DSS compliance of their own systems and infrastructure and the sub-merchants they onboard, depending on how the payment data is handled, of course. Data breaches, fraud, or non-compliance at either the sub-merchant or the PayFac level can lead to fines, penalties, reputational damage, and even removal from the card networks. Now, just to illustrate this with a few statistics, as you can see here behind me, in 2018, there were 966 payment facilitators globally, increasing to 2,108 in 2024. And by 2025, it's predicted that there will be 2,380 PayFacs operating worldwide. Now, looking at the gross payment volume, this is also significantly increased. Between 2018 and 2019, this increased by 32% in just 1 year alone. It's expected to increase to a further over 4 trillion by 2025. Such growth can be explained by an increased number of payment facilitators worldwide and an expansion of current payment facilitators' customer bases. As the PayFac model continues to power the global shift to embedded payments, ensuring strong PCI compliance is no longer a checkbox activity. It's a business-critical requirement. In this session, as Sam already mentioned, we'll explore how to navigate the master merchant sub-merchant relationship and how acquiring banks and card networks can cooperate together with PayFacs to mitigate risk, achieve compliance, and deliver agile, frictionless payments. So what about the evolution of the PayFac model? How did it all start? Well, Visa and MasterCard, they introduced the payment facilitator model into their rules to ensure that platforms could act as merchant aggregators within a regulated, risk-controlled framework. A payment facilitator, like Toast, acts as a middle layer between sub-merchants and acquiring banks, handling the technical, financial, and compliance complexities involved in payment processing. This enables faster onboarding, lower friction, and easier access to electronic payments for small and medium-sized businesses. They allow small businesses and individual sellers to accept payments quickly without going through a traditional merchant account setup. The evolution from the traditional acquiring to the PayFac model. In the traditional setup, merchants, they needed to go through a direct relationship with the acquiring bank in order to accept payments. This model works very well for large enterprise merchants, but can introduce friction for smaller merchants, such as lengthy onboarding, high compliance burdens, and also complex integrations. With the rise of online platforms, a new need emerged, allowing many small sub-sellers to accept payments quickly within a platform. This led to the development of the PayFac model. The concept of PayFac has undergone significant evolution since its inception, driven by the need for more efficient and accessible payment processing solutions. So what about the entities involved in this setup, and what role do they play? Behind me, you can see here the PayFac ecosystem relationship diagram. So starting with the shopper, otherwise known as the cardholder, this is the individual who uses a credit or debit card to purchase goods or services from a sub-merchant. The cardholder holds a relationship with the sub-merchant. They purchase goods or services from the sub-merchant. The sub-merchant is the actual business, like a small shop, for instance, that sells directly to the cardholder. They operate under the PayFac's umbrella, but they don't hold a direct contract with the acquiring bank. The sub-merchant holds a relationship with the PayFac. The transaction is processed under the PayFac's master account. The PayFac is the entity that holds a master account with the acquiring bank. They onboard, underwrite, and manage compliance for all sub-merchants under its portfolio. They then route the cardholder's payments through its systems for processing. The PayFac holds a relationship with the acquiring bank. The PayFac submits the aggregated transactions to the acquiring bank. An acquirer, like Adyen, is the financial institution that processes card payments on behalf of the PayFac and its sub-merchants. The acquiring bank subsequently holds a relationship with the card networks, who holds a relationship with the issuing bank. The acquiring bank routes the payment request through the card networks to the issuing bank for approval. And finally, settlement. Funds flow back from the issuing bank through the card networks to the acquiring bank. The acquirer can settle directly to the sub-merchant or via the PayFac to the sub-merchant, depending on licensing.
Now, as Helen mentioned, we now have two merchants in this ecosystem. So I've titled this slide, "Will the Real Merchant Please Stand Up?" The PayFac is considered the master merchant, and the traditional business entity we have conventionally called the merchant is now termed a sub-merchant. You'll see a number of new merchant-related terms in this ecosystem, which may have meanings that are not standardized among regulatory bodies. Terms like platform merchant, original merchant, merchant business, sponsored merchant, direct merchant, primary merchant, and merchant of record. Well, what does this mean in light of this traditional merchant acquiring relationship? Now, it's not the goal of this presentation here today to define these terms because, frankly, they're not well defined within the industry. Nor is it the goal of this discussion to identify where an entity identified as merchant by one of these terms may have common roles or contractual obligations, because this too varies from one agreement to the next. Now, this being the case, the most important thing for us to understand here today is the importance of identifying responsibilities in the agreements in which you participate. Submerchants should examine their merchant service agreements with their PayFacs to understand their responsibilities. Similarly, PayFacs and acquirers must identify the responsibilities and communicate these clearly one with another and also with our merchants. Now, as it relates to PCI DSS, these responsibilities are what is meant in 12.8.5 and 12.9.2 when we talk about merchants maintaining a list of requirements met by their service providers, and the service providers providing this information to the merchants in the form of an AOC and responsibility documentation. Well, what about reporting templates and eligibility for self-assessment questionnaires that are deemed merchant SAQs? Well, let's look at FAQ 1079. Here we define what a merchant is in terms of PCI's glossary. It's an entity that accepts payment cards bearing the logo of a PCI SSC participating payment brand as payment for goods or services. But number two, it can also be a service provider. A PayFac may be a service provider if their services result in storing, processing, or transmitting cardholder data on behalf of other merchants or service providers. So, for a master merchant whose role is to protect account data for its sub-merchants, this generally means considering applicable requirements labeled as service provider only and reporting on the service provider template, such as the service provider ROC. Now, however, this is ultimately something that the PayFac must coordinate with their compliance accepting entity, as described in FAQ 1473. Since acceptance of reports on PCI SSC templates is ultimately at the discretion of the compliance accepting entity, this FAQ provides all necessary leeway for acquirers or brands to make those judgment calls. Now, where it's not a compliance entity, but the PCI SSC does define acceptable activities by merchants in some of its programs. One notable case is the point-to-point encryption program, where requirements stipulate that activities a merchant cannot perform and allocate for the acceptance or the validation of a merchant-managed solution or merchant as a solution provider. In these cases, there may be room for PCI to consider whether its glossary definition of merchant, in light of PayFacs, is clear and reduces any of that remaining confusion.
So what about marketplaces? We've mentioned marketplaces now a few times. Marketplaces, they may facilitate payments between buyers and multiple sellers. The marketplace itself is typically the merchant of record for the transaction. The seller, or the third party, does not have a direct merchant relationship with the acquirer. The platform owns and operates the e-commerce platform. The platform accepts payments on behalf of sellers, and sellers are not registered merchants with the card networks. Whilst marketplaces and payment facilitators both serve as intermediaries between buyers and sellers, they are fundamentally different in terms of structure, regulation, and responsibility, especially in the context of payments and compliance. With regards to compliance and risk, marketplaces may reduce their burden by outsourcing certain compliance obligations to processors or acquirers, whereas PayFacs, they own the compliance stack. They're responsible for PCI DSS, KYC, AML, chargeback monitoring, and sub-merchant oversight. With regards to PCI scope, understanding and managing PCI scope is especially important for payment facilitators and their sub-merchants, since both can be exposed to different levels of risk depending on their setup. The PayFac is responsible for providing a PCI-compliant infrastructure and for educating and supporting sub-merchants.
So let's talk about some strategies for PayFac PCI DSS compliance. Now first, again, I'm sure the theme has come up. We have bicycles, but let's talk in terms of a bicycle peloton. Now, the PCI SSC leads the way. They're managing the standards and the programs. These and provide guidance that for this global community to help us in understanding and implementing according to their best practices. Whereas The card networks, they set the rules and requirements for those participating in the ecosystem, and that includes PayFacs. They also require PayFac registration through a sponsoring acquirer. They also enforce that PCI compliance or compliance in general among their acquirers and submerchants. They will also provide monitoring services for PayFacs to ensure that we are aligned with their network operating requirements. The acquirer is ultimately liable to the card networks for the risk and compliance and the performance of their PayFacs and our submerchants. The acquirer reports PCI compliance to those card networks. The PayFac in this model is the master merchant, as we described, or equivalent to that term, if that is not the exact term in many acquirer agreements. That's the generic term, again, we'll use. And in that role, they take on the role of the aggregator. They do the onboarding management of multiple submerchants, as Helen said, performing underwriting, KYC, and onboarding. They provide payment processing infrastructure, such as checkout, point of sale, APIs. Now, while those marketplaces are another type, and they have a different set of PCI responsibilities. Submerchants, those individual sellers and businesses, they're onboarded under the PayFacs master merchant account, and they follow the leader. So they, again, follow the guidance provided by the acquirers, the PayFacs following the acquirer's guidance and onward. Now let's talk about a few best practices that Helen and I have discovered and discussed as far as our relationship, because this is crucial. It's important to embed PCI at the outset, where the PayFac engages with the submerchants, or we call them customers. There's an important due diligence process. Our platform must be PCI compliant. And then when we engage with our submerchants through that onboarding process, we're building PCI into that entire process. Our integrations understand how scope is going to be affected, and we manage risk of the cardholder data, of any cardholder data events, through our mature governance and merchant solutions. And finally, from a reporting standpoint, the PayFac designates the submerchant level, handles that reporting to the acquirer, and ultimately allowing the acquirer to report accurately to the schemes. We call this a 360-degree PCI compliance approach.
So, as Sam already mentioned, what are some of the PCI DSS compliance best practices that we've learned whilst working together with Toast? Firstly, collaborate closely with the acquirer, really aligning on perspectives and risk mitigation, and understanding the unique business model can go a very long way. Secondly, shared responsibility. PCI DSS compliance should become a shared responsibility whereby a responsibility matrix is clearly defined, not simply a box-ticking exercise. And lastly, scope the impact. Toast, for instance, as a closed system, gives them more control over the various payment implementations, devices, and acceptance channels. Furthermore, by providing or enforcing the use of specific tools, for instance, via hosted checkout or tokenized APIs, a PayFac can significantly speed up merchant onboarding, simplify the process for confirming SAQ eligibility and submitting the form, lower security risk exposure, and also meet the acquirer and card network expectations. So looking ahead, as we close, it's important to stress that the PayFac model, it's not static. As you can see, it's evolved with time. It was designed to adapt, and it's doing exactly that, rapidly evolving in response to shifts in consumer behavior, technological innovation, and regulatory frameworks. This has also been seen in the evolution of PCI standards, the support of new payment models, the rise of embedded finance and platform as a service model. With these models comes a need for more sophisticated onboarding, risk monitoring, and settlement capabilities, often across borders and regulatory jurisdictions. Changes to consumer payment behavior. It's accelerating, and it can really accelerate the change. We're seeing a massive uptake in digital wallets, contactless payments, buy now, pay later, and real-time payments. All of this puts pressure on platforms to offer faster, more transparent, and omni-channel payment experiences. And lastly, international expansion. PayFacs are a foundational layer in the future of the payments infrastructure. Staying agile, compliant, and customer-centric will define long-term success. Thank you.